We've got some hype train running backs just killing our fantasy rosters right now, and it might be time to get honest. This week on the True North Fantasy Pod, let's get it. What up, fantasy people? Welcome back. I am Trav, hosting and West Coastin'. This is the True North Fantasy Football Podcast. Thanks for joining. Make sure you go subscribe on that YouTube channel, like the video, leave a comment if you enjoy it. Really appreciating everybody tuning in. It's been fun to be back, and we are 1/3 of the way into the season. 6 weeks are in the books, and we have a bunch of running backs who we were very hopeful for, guys who we thought could take the next leap, maybe give us some signs of life when there previously were none. A bunch of these guys are underperforming right now, and I'm here to talk about it. Some of these guys are guys that I've invested in, lots of hype on them in the offseason. And the first guy we're going to talk about is we are going to go down to Florida. We're going to talk about Rachaad White of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Currently, Rachaad White is the running back 24 in PPR formats. He unfortunately has only had one game so far within the top 20 in PPR. And honestly, he's been a bit of a net negative as far as return on investment with that late 5th, early 6th round pick you used on him. So not great so far for Rachaad White. And the usage has really been good, though. He's got elite running back usage. He is top 5 in snap share among running backs. He's got the 4th highest route participation. I think the issue with Rachaad White is that we're just not seeing those explosive plays that we thought were baked into his profile as that kind of smaller, shifty back who can slash through the line and break away from those defensive backs. He's not been doing that this year, and it's making for a super frustrating fantasy asset, especially, being that we were expecting him to solidify that running back 2 spot on our team as a guy who we thought was going to get all of this volume, but we thought there was going to be some efficiency to it. And to look at the volume, just to kind of break it down a little bit, we see that Rachaad White is averaging 15 rush attempts over the past 4 weeks. That's all we were hoping from him, honestly, coming into this season, so nothing wrong with that. Top 12 in the league in red zone rushing attempts, which is great, but that's only resulted in 1 touchdown for Rachaad White. So he's really not capitalizing on some of the lucrative touches that he's getting. He's got under 3.5 yards per carry so far this season on 70 rush attempts, 0 explosive runs on those 70 carries. So he hasn't taken one of them for more than 15 plus yards. And that's a problem. That is a problem. That was supposed to be a big piece of his upside as a rusher, was the big plays, because we kind of thought that some of that volume was going to be limited. And that's why I was drafting him, just for those big plays. But it's kind of backwards a little bit, where the volume is up and the efficiency is way down. And I think the more concerning part about volume, if we're going to look there with concerns, is the target volume. He's only averaging about 3 targets per game so far, and that receiving work was supposed to be the bread and butter, but he's only averaging just over 5 PPR points per game as a receiver. And that's not going to cut it for the guy who we thought was going to be, giving us those maybe 90 targets in that offense that seems fairly condensed between him, Mike Evans, and Chris Godwin. And it is, but it's just been kind of underperformance by Rachaad White specifically, not necessarily by the offense, not by the usage that he's receiving. So, like I said, that top 20 finish was in week 3. Otherwise, he's basically finishing outside the top 30 of running backs every week. And so what are we doing with Rachaad White? He's one of my favorite running backs. I'll give him that. But he's kind of right in that like James Cook, Alex Madison range, where he's getting enough work where you're going to consider starting him in that flex spot versus some other guys. But then the week finishes and he didn't really add any value over what any of those bench guys got you. And maybe that dart throw wide receiver way outscored him and could have won you your week. So I think just the narrative around him, and when we see his results after being slotted in our roster, is just disappointing all around. You look at Alvin Kamara. Going into Thursday Night Football, that was his 4th game played, but previous to that, he'd played 3 games, and he was ahead of Rachaad White at running back 23 in PPR, and that's half the games played that Rachaad White had through week 6. So not great. I was kind of expecting the Wish version of Alvin Kamara out of Rachaad White, if that makes any sense, but he's been more like a Wish version of like Joe Mixon with the, good rushing volume, frustrating receiving volume, and extremely low efficiency. That's basically been Rachaad White. So he's kind of been resorted to a rotational flex play at this point until further notice, and further notice is going to be an uptick in that production and that volume remaining consistent. The good part is he doesn't have much competition for volume in Tampa Bay. He is getting the volume to be able to produce at like a top 15 clip. But I mean, continuing with the negatives, the schedule doesn't really do him any favors. Of his next 5 matchups, only Houston and Buffalo are decent matchups for running backs in that span. The Niners and Titans are 2 of those teams, and they're 2 of the best, as are the Atlanta Falcons, who the Bucs have this week in Week 7. The Atlanta Falcons are one of only 4 teams to allow just 1 rushing touchdown on the season, and they've only given up 6 runs of 15-plus yards. So Rachaad White in himself is not getting any big plays in Week 7. He faces a team that is also not giving up any big plays, so not a great recipe. And then if you look at fantasypoints.com, shout out to the Fantasy Points data suite over there. Love cruising around that. The O-line, D-line matchup this week against the Atlanta Falcons is the second worst matchup of the week as far as rushing goes. So I'd be steering clear of Rachaad White this week, and it's going to be really hard to start him in the next few weeks. So like I said, because I really like him as a player, I am hopeful for that bounce back on that volume that he's getting. But bad matchups, bad production so far. I don't hate trying to move off of him as somebody you're considering in the flex spot for sure. Okay, the Houston Texans trotting out a overachieving offense, as I believe I mentioned on last week's episode, but not in the rushing department. We've got Dameon Pierce drafted as what was supposed to be a strong running back 2. Currently, the running back 27 right now, so just outside that range. And he only has 2 finishes inside the top 20 so far this year. So he's really just been clogging up that running back 2 spot if you're still starting him. Weeks 3 and 4, those were his only good weeks. He was the running back 14 and the running back 17 respectively, averaged 13.3 PPR points in those 2 weeks. But then in the other 4 weeks, he's averaged a finish of the running back 38, and he's only scoring 6.2 fantasy points per game in that span. So all of that comes out in the wash to be a bad running back and an investment that we're probably regretting from our fantasy drafts. And I think that's probably a trend for Dameon Pierce. I never really thought he was this running back who could take command of the role. Kind of always thought he was going to be like a plotter plus at best. Maybe a little bit of David Montgomery in him because he does break a lot of tackles, but he doesn't break away from defenders to give you any big plays. Only 1 explosive run on the season from Dameon Pierce. And then you look, the offensive line isn't doing him any favors. As we know, terrible run blocking offensive line in Houston. His yards before contact per attempt is less than a half a yard. Third lowest number of any running back with at least 50 rushing attempts. So the ecosystem around him's not good, and the talent that he's bringing to the table is also not cutting it for our fantasy teams. That kind of runner needs big touchdown numbers in any given season to have any worthwhile ceiling. So I don't see that necessarily happening with Dameon Pierce, and I think case in point for that is that he's tied for 8th in goal line carries among running backs, but he's only got 1 touchdown to show for it. So not great for Dameon Pierce. I'm not super invested, but I would say you should probably get him into flex consideration at best, if not moving away from him. The only good news for him is that after this week's bye, 5 of their next 7 matchups are against bottom 7 defenses in terms of rushing yards allowed to running backs. But then flipping back to the bad news, my guy Devin Singletary is starting to insert himself in the running back room here in Houston. Single Buckets had more than 50% of the snaps in week 6 to Pierce's 35%. And I think that's something to monitor with Singletary because he's been a decent receiver. He's been a guy who's held down kind of the lead-ish role in the backfield in Buffalo before. And I think he brings a lot more big play upside than Pierce does as well. So in an offense that, like I said, is overachieving, passing game is doing pretty well right now, I could see them wanting to try and get a little juice in that running back room. So keep an eye on Devin Singletary's snap shares as far as valuing Dameon Pierce, really. But I would say in those games with those good matchups, if he does have any good performances, you should be capitalizing on that recouped value and getting out on Dameon Pierce. So this is the time to be evaluating your roster, whether you're a contender. And he's one of those guys that could be a piece in the package that gets you through that stretch run by acquiring one of these more elite options, or a guy who's even producing more efficiently on maybe less volume than is Dameon Pierce. I actually went on the Undrafted Fantasy Football podcast with my guy Jax Falcone this week. Go check that out on the Undroppables podcast network. We actually talked about how all the cool kids are into Houston's passing game anyway, so I don't even think you really want to invest in any of the guys on this team, as much as I do like a little bit of Devin Singletary. But yeah, go check out that pod with Jax, the Undrafted Fantasy Football podcast. Follow him on the socials and check it out on the Undroppables podcast network. It's a good show. Okay, this next guy's a little bit cheeky because he has missed a couple of games, and that would be rookie Jahmyr Gibbs. Not going to spend too much time on him, but I thought it was kind of important to touch on him just because he is potentially coming into a starting role in week 7 for the Lions with David Montgomery out. Jahmyr Gibbs, running back 33 in PPR so far this season amidst a little bit of frustrating usage from Coach Dan Campbell in Detroit. Obviously, Gibbs has missed 2 games, so that's why I was saying this one's a little bit cheeky because he's missed time, so you can't really say that he's underperforming, but I think we can expect to see maybe some better performances from him going forward as he gets more acclimated to the offense, coming back from an injury of his own early in his rookie year. So I thought it was important to touch on him for sure because he could be somebody who comes to the fantasy forefront with David Montgomery out. Looks like he's going to miss 2 games, so not a big sample for Jahmyr Gibbs, but this is his chance to show something. Baltimore this week is a tough matchup, but I think Gibbs is one of those guys, unlike Dameon Pierce, that can give you some explosive plays on maybe a little bit more limited volume. So a couple big pop plays against the Baltimore Ravens, and his week's going to be just fine. And then you look at week 8, they get the Raiders before their week 9 bye. The Raiders defense, bottom 10 in rushing yards, rushing touchdowns, and rushing fantasy points allowed to running backs so far this season. Right around the middle of the pack against receivers out of the backfield. But that's a juicy matchup for Jahmyr Gibbs in week 8. So I think these next 2 weeks could be solid for him to showcase what he can do and maybe take a little bit more of that pie from David Montgomery, who is still the lead back when healthy. I think the one thing we might be a little bit worried about for Jahmyr Gibbs in these next 2 games is Craig Reynolds. He's showed well in limited work as that supporting guy the last couple weeks. So keep an eye out for him, but I don't think he is to the detriment of Jahmyr Gibbs as what David Montgomery is. So I'm not too worried. And I think the next two weeks, Gibbs is probably a borderline running back 1 with his explosive playability. We saw that already early in the season. And then we're hopefully going to see some of that volume get stacked on top of it, which is just the perfect storm for that running back 1. And even when David Montgomery's back, I think Jahmyr Gibbs is like right on that running back 2-3 fence. I would definitely just, in isolation of knowing what happens weeks down the road, I would say you're starting Jahmyr Gibbs over Dameon Pierce, even in situations when David Montgomery is there. So, just really think that Jahmyr Gibbs is going to have a nice little late season surge, even on the limited volume. So don't let that stress you out a little bit. Some of the stuff that Dan Campbell's coming out and saying in endorsement of David Montgomery is good, just good for David Montgomery, not necessarily bad for Jahmyr Gibbs in my opinion there. So love me some Jahmyr Gibbs going down the stretch. If you can acquire before week 7 here, I would probably do so because he's probably just going to get more expensive. Couple more that are absolutely killing our fantasy rosters this season are Javonte Williams, the running back 40 so far, and Najee Harris, the running back 45. Javonte Williams just hasn't looked the same coming back from that injury. I think it's probably time to start thinking about getting out on him for our dynasty teams. And then for season long, he's currently being outproduced by Jaleel McLaughlin, so not looking great for the rest of the season. And I wonder if we maybe misevaluated him from the jump, Javonte Williams, just being that, yeah, he's shown some explosive playability, but he's not been able to put it together consistently. And so, I think that ascension that we were hoping for when we drafted him in our rookie drafts just isn't going to be coming. So adjust accordingly, and you pretty much just can't start him on your fantasy rosters right now. If there's another injury in that backfield, maybe. Samaje Perine actually has one of the highest target shares of any running back on the season. So there's a few guys getting mixed in here, and Javonte is really tanked for it. So kind of sucks, but he was one of my favorite guys. Drafted a lot of him, but I'm really being honest with my Javonte takes now because I can't get latched onto the love that I have for him when he is really putting my fantasy roster at a disadvantage because I want to start him. The other guy you can put a fork in is Najee Harris. 0 touchdowns so far on the season. He's lost all the passing work to Jaylen Warren. Hilariously, he has the highest explosive run percentage of any running back that has at least 50 rushing attempts, but you can't do anything with them. You can't expect any production out of them. You can't expect him to sustain those big plays. So I think these guys are both just bench clogger bye week fill-ins for now. And really, in all honesty, your waiver wire probably doesn't have many better options. So unless there's a better dart throw out there, it's fine to keep these guys on your bench, but you don't feel great about it. That's for sure. Last but not least, not an underperformer, actually probably an overperformer, but just wanted to give a shout out to my guy, Chuba Hubbard. Had a solid week last week in week 6, taking over 75% of the snaps with Miles Sanders out. hoping that he has claimed that lead role because Miles Sanders was not looking good before that in the season. So just big shout out to that Canadian Chuba Hubbard. Go back on the YouTube channel, check it out. We did have the chance to interview Chuba in his rookie season. I put a reel up last week on the Instagram account just with a little bit of a clip from that episode, but if you want to go back and check it out, I can't remember exactly when it was from. He was a rookie in 2020. And yeah, just search Chuba Hubbard on the YouTube channel and you'll be able to find that there. And that's all I got for you this week. Some underperforming running backs who may not necessarily have the bounce back that we are hoping for. Really appreciative of everybody who's tuned in. Make sure you go subscribe on social media. Make sure you hit that subscribe button, like the video, leave a comment. Really want to hear what you want. I'd like to tailor this show to the audience. So if there's anything you want to see, any research projects you want me to do and bring up on an episode, would love to see it. Thanks again. Really appreciate it. Go get them W's in week 7. Peace.